All right, part one. Big time, solid dude, power lifter, solid in terms of his body. I think that's very, very important to start to appreciate that when you begin an evaluation process, and even before you get into subjective, you're certainly going through, you're eyeing the person down. You're looking for gross asymmetries. You're looking for, things that stick out, looking for pink elephants. And one of the pink elephant, when you have a 325-pound human being that looks athletic and has big bubbly traps, etc., we know that the quality of the tissue, if we do need to make changes in the tissue, is going to require some significant artillery, and that'll come back to where we think the therapy needs to come here. So already you have there's some powerlifters that are really, really flexible, like me in my day, but I'm not that's not who I am anymore in terms of powerlifter. But usually when you see a very, very thick, very, very dense, muscled individual, you do expect to see certain things. And look, your evaluation will confirm or deny. I'm not going to whiteboard any of the injury history because he had no pain. Warming up, it would have no pain in our evaluation. So his history of, I think he's got 4-5 and 5-1 that have history of central symptoms. I think he talked about his right knee, right shoulder, but no pain. But also perhaps no pain in his words, because this is anybody who's handling serious wheels probably has a degree of toughness, and being uncomfortable, stiff is not what somebody would call pain. Okay, that being said, none of those things were aggravated or affected what we saw from a movement perspective. Now, if you add a significant capacity component and that elicited pain, it's not what we're looking for in level one of our evaluation. You're always using evaluation-based thoughts to make changes and coach. But to start the process of where do we need to go to get where we're going is irrelevant. I think there's a little bit of a commentary there on the type of where you begin the evaluation, whether you're screening someone to go into your training, or you're screening somebody for their movement health, or you're doing that with only as minimal variables as possible, which I think is the more correct way, versus looking at other things. If you look at movement with load or with complexity and they fail and they deliver something, well, how do you know if it's just because there's some issue with the joint, there's some issue with the tissue, or they're just overloaded? So I think we should be looking at things as body weight. I think we should be looking at single repetitions, and then we break things down where we're only looking for, can joints get in the right positions to absorb and adapt to stress? If this individual is having trouble recovering from his training, well then the first thing we're going to knock off the list is, well, maybe you're choosing exercises that are not compatible with what these joints can easily get into. Because as we did in that little runner up to this video, when you're strong and you're athletic, you can make it look good. But that doesn't mean that, well, then why do you have a problem? Well, let's strip it back, and a person can always decide what they want to do. But we shouldn't be evaluating movement with load. I mean, this is asinine. This is makes no sense. Let's make sure they can do what you're asking them to do from a joint level first, then add components of strength, power, and endurance in a second layer of evaluation. In this case, it's not his problem. This is not a weak human being. This is an individual. You have to assume that this is an issue more with joint integrity and choices of how he stabilizes, rather than some of these more I guess just to call it the next level of measures in terms of output, movement, then output. All right, so again, same way, we would start with anybody. We would look at the SFMA, and we'll start with Remember, I always start with multi-segmental flexion forward bending because remember in 2008 there was no neck and shoulders. That's just how we do it. So whatever, as you know, using whatever order you want to do is totally fine. And as well as when there is an acute issue, we certainly are not going to be even looking at that movement, but you're always going to be using the concepts that the whole model is based upon while you look functionally myopically at a total knee or a surgical shoulder. So number one with multi-segmental flexion, as you know, I like to use these faces. It was really not very good. No pain, which I thought was fantastic. So if somebody's going to express forward bending and not say that there's any pain, all right, well, we're in a much better situation. But he had significant knee bend, and really what is now an issue right off the bat, that when you see that someone doesn't have a good toe touch, and you don't necessarily know why yet. We don't know if it's uniform spinal flexion. We don't know if it's posterior chain stiffness. We don't know if it's a closing joint issue at the hip. You don't know any of these things yet. What you do know is that they're probably not sitting back into a squat. Now, whether they use a very knee dominant pattern or a very hip dominant pattern, not relevant in this case, because you need some degree of posterior weight shift. You need the femoral head to roll posteriorly. We need to learn about that posterior hip capsule before we get anywhere else. So to find that this individual is having issues from some kind of squatting, some kind of level change where we do need posterior glide of that hip through the capsule, we're going to find that I'm not surprised that he's stiff, but I was thrilled that he did not have pain. So we have to build out a plan there. Number two, multi-segmental extension, summarily stiff, but it wasn't nearly as far from something you would consider acceptable. Arms down, no change. We didn't really look at right versus left. When we looked at multi-segmental rotation, it is so irrelevant as to which side, because they were both very, very, very limited. So, but again, no problem through the spine. In this case, because we were so far from satisfactory, we did look at deloading each side through a toe touch weight bearing, and we saw significant change. In some case, it actually looked really ideal. Did we get to 90 degrees? Close when we looked at some of this. Now, both had two different levels of limitation. We had a loss of internal rotation on one side and a loss of external rotation on the other side. So neither side had great internal rotation, but the right was significantly more limited than the left. Okay, well, maybe that's going to get us to where we had this history of right knee pain. Okay, so now single leg stance is not a part of where we're going to learn anything right now when you've got those limitations here. When we looked at the deep squat, and this is where we saw some of that knee pain. Okay, so we're going to probably look at that rotation there on that side. Okay, things are really making quite a bit of sense as to why this individual would struggle with recovering from intense back squat training. Okay, what else are we going to look at? We looked at the shoulders, and let's just say from lateral rotation flexion, they were not the biggest issue, even though they were significantly limited. When you see somebody with gigantic arms, okay, well, that's going to be a soft tissue approximation issue. Nothing on the neck, but medial rotation flexion was very rough. I believe it was the right side that he couldn't barely get his hand into his pocket, and the left side was what you would typically see for a bigger guy. So we need to understand that, as we talked in the runner, that if you take this degrees of asymmetry and take it to a highly symmetrical movement, it shouldn't surprise that there's history of spinal issues. To say a powerlifter's got a beat up shoulder, okay, that's kind of how, it's kind of what you signed up for. But when you don't understand, how come this individual who has similar body type and similar performance measures, they get out alive, but this one doesn't. One possible reason can be because your joints can't get into the right positions to absorb and adapt to stress. So in the way I evaluated here, just given the way this was set up at that seminar, we went to another room, didn't have a table, and he was already really irritated based on what he had done before as part of the seminar in front of everybody. Took him into another room. I refused to see him if it was in front of everybody at the course. He was already highly irritated because, but again, it's okay. It's not like it was anybody's fault, but you can't possibly expect one group of exercises to help this person. This is not a stabilization issue. This is clearly a can joint go from A to B type. Of course, if we look at the strategy in which he chooses to control his system, his body, that by definition is stabilization. But the solution is not more stabilization exercises. When we get into part 2 and beyond here, I do think there is a role for certain exercises that maybe you would have learned in a DNS course. But you can't just jump at this without evaluating, talking about concepts that you want to see this magic act so that it has this indelible response from a student. I think that's fantastic. I would try to do the same thing. But if you did an evaluation, you would know that none of those things would work. Because when you got a shoulder that barely gets in, he can't even pull his wallet out of his back pocket. When you have rotation right and left that look, he's basically getting to like 30 degrees. You take one leg out and you can get probably to 80 plus. It's not the spine. So whatever rehabilitation and recovery he's engaged in for the spine is probably done very, very well. And now if we can take some time to hide from these limitations, which we'll get to in some of the later parts of this case study, on like what exercises would we do? What exercises should we do? Well, I know we should be hiding until we can get better. We should be hiding from the shoulders. We should be hiding from some of these maybe deeper positions. But maybe the reason that he's got these adaptations that limit posterior shift in a hinging pattern is because he's always got a bar in his back. Well, one of the things that I can give you a clue, we certainly have every intent to use the safety bar, camber bar, etc., transformer bar that there's obviously made in the same building. Zerker squat comes to mind. There was a biceps injury, so without having keen evaluation of that or really knowing more, we're not going there. It makes sense in terms of hiding from the shoulders, and we're probably going to accept a high lift. That's where rack pull is going to come into play. So I'm already giving away like a thought process of when you see something like this, the first thing we should be thinking about is not always how do you fix these things? How do you bring them back to a satisfactory point? I'm more interested in how can we train, because if we can train and really get after the humoral and hormonal factors that great training and work capacity can bring, it's going to make the rehabilitation and the changing of the tissue, because you're not fixing anything, you're just remodeling. You're creating new stress, new load, new adaptations that are desirable instead of these adaptations that I drew up here on the board that are not desirable for his terminal activity. If he didn't powerlift, maybe he wouldn't have a problem, but he's significantly limited in these motions. But because he's so strong and so athletic, it's almost like none of this you would never tell, because he did not look bad in warming up with an empty bar or one wheel, etc. He looked even better when he had no bar on his back. He just sat on the box to do some of these stabilization strategies that had no effect on him, because it's not his problem. When you see significant limitations in how someone moves, if you do stabilization approach first, it should work. Doesn't mean it sticks, but you should see a dramatic change. You're not seeing a dramatic change with big bubbly shoulders and big thick thighs. The tissue doesn't respond to those neurological inputs. We need to be a little bit more guided, and we need to soften it up. I described, I think, some of these quick dramatic changes that are all very, very real and very, very defensible and explainable with scientific merit. This is like coaxing the nervous system, just giving it a little guidance, because you do have the joints that can get in the right positions. When sometimes we do need some other approaches to demand it and to maybe kick the door down a little bit, to create tissue that can then be coaxed. So you'll certainly get to those other places. I think there's some other types of activities that are going to require much more tension and much more intended compartmentalized approach. I show here because one of the exercises we'll show is what we tried to do with the SC joint. Because that right shoulder was so miserable, we look at the SC joint, we look at the AC joint, we look at scapulothoracic, and then of course glenohumeral. And I'm in and out. Like this, I don't even know if this took an hour, because it's just not the way this was set up. But there's still a lot of information that we're going to create here. I'm going to demonstrate some of those exercises, and then we'll put it all together on the whiteboard again. So big shoulder, hips, etc. I'll show you where we started, and then we'll go over the notes of where we're going, but definitely go over how we're going to train.